more holistic and impactful solutions. So today we'll be showcasing a very successful model of collaboration, and we aim to inspire action within your own companies and supply chain. So just quickly to do some housekeeping, this webinar is held under Chatham House rules, and it is also being recorded and will be available for replay afterwards for CGF members. So moving on to our agenda for today, we will have presentations from our esteemed speakers from Delterra and from Mars Inc., followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A session where you will have the chance to engage directly with our speakers. So as you can see, we have a Q&A feature and a chat that you can utilize. So we really do encourage you to put all your questions there, and we will be answering them during the Q&A section of this webinar. So thank you again, and we hope you find this session very insightful and valuable. I will hand it over to my colleague Delia now.
Thank you, Alisa, for the introduction. It's nice to see everyone connected here. My name is Delia. I'm the Sustainability Officer of the Plastic Waste Coalition of Action. As many of you know, the Consumer Goods Forum really stands at the forefront of bringing together key players from the fast-moving consumer goods industry. With our 9 coalition of action, we are really working collectively on a vast range of topics that really span all of the spectrum of both environmental and social responsibility, as well as other topics like data and food safety. Our core mission is to really convene and accompany our members in moving the needle across all of these topics. And obviously, a crucial part of that is fostering connection and breaking down silos. Today's webinar and conversation is an illustration of this bigger effort. We're again specifically focusing on plastic waste, food waste, and human rights, and most importantly, how these topics intersect and influence one another. But real progress really lies in exploring these synergies, inspiring all of us on how to think holistically about creating circular and more equitable systems. It's no easy task to break down these silos, but it is essential. And why is it essential? Because we know that some problems are just too big to solve for one company. The challenges associated with plastic waste and food waste are immense. And addressing these challenges isn't solely an environmental and business concern, but also one connected to social responsibility and human rights, particularly for all of the informal workers and waste pickers that are playing such a vital role in managing waste and recycling streams globally. Their livelihoods and dignity must be considered in the solutions and projects we build. This is where also the unique role of businesses and CGF members come into play. Businesses have the knowledge, the innovation, and the reach to drive meaningful change through sustainable practices, strategic partnerships, and support for community programs. Again, to illustrate this, we wanted to showcase some successful models of collaboration, some real world examples of how partnerships can really unlock transformative change. We'll hear from Delterra, who are doing some fascinating work, building projects from the ground up in high leakage countries, as well as Mars, who will share more into their strategic vision for partnerships and how they approach it. The goal today is to really inspire each of you to consider how these approaches can be adapted and championed within your own organization and supply chains. So we're going to take the opportunity to exchange ideas, learn from one another, and reinforce our collective commitments. So I'm more pleased to introduce Mike Stockman, Director of Programs for Circular Innovation at Delterra. Mike leads Delterra's efforts to make material value chains more efficient, transparent, and ethical, with over 15 years of experience, including pivotal work in waste management and recycling in East Africa, as well as a background in public health from his Peace Corps service. Mike brings a wealth of life, practical, and impactful experience. Welcome, Mike. We will also hear from Alison Lim, the Global VP of Packaging Sustainability at Mars Inc. Alison leads Mars' ambitious strategy, to improve the sustainability of their packaging, showing the kind of strategic vision and collaborative mindset needed for systemic change. She has spent the majority of her career driving sustainability at major brands such as P&G, Starbucks, and Coca-Cola. She's also a significant voice in the wider industry, an active member of our Plastic Waste Coalition of Action, as well as the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty, serving also on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation Advisory Board. Welcome, Alison. The exchange will be moderated by Maria Isabel Cubides, a human rights lawyer and senior manager leading the Human Rights Coalition at CGF.
Thank you, Delia, and I'm so glad to be so honored to be moderating this discussion between Mike and Alison, who will definitely have a lot to share. So I'll try to keep my remarks very short and just pass it on and make sure that our discussion is very smooth. So let's go to you, Mike, first. You have a very interesting title, Director of Programs, Reshaping Markets and Redesigning Packaging. That's quite a big ambition by itself. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit more about Delterra's mission and approach to circular waste management? Why did you decide to work on this space, and how does the three topics that we're addressing today connect together?
Perfect. Thanks, Maria. I appreciate it. And just quickly, thanks to CGF for the invitation and for the shout out to Peace Corps. These are trying days for Peace Corps, so we're hoping that it survives. So Delterra, for those of you who don't know, is a non-for-profit organization working to bridge global commitments with local action to make materials more circular. Our vision is a world where human activities protect and restore a healthy planet, and our immediate goal is to reduce the environmental impact from waste. The reason that we work on this topic is, and I think that everybody in this call sort of understands the context in which we're working, we are clearly drowning in waste, and the environmental impact of that is enormous. A couple of metrics to highlight this. Nearly 11 million metric tons of plastic enter our oceans on an annual basis. And with plastics production set to almost double by 2040, those numbers are only going to increase. Waste is the third largest source of methane emissions after agriculture and fossil fuel mining. And methane is obviously a major contributor to climate change, it being a more powerful greenhouse gas than even carbon dioxide in the short term. And we think that these metrics are possible in part because about 2 billion people have no access to waste management today, the vast majority of those people living in countries in the global south. Obviously, nobody likes the current situation, and corporates and governments and public want to take action, but we know that our current efforts aren't enough, and we need a different approach. So I imagine if we sort of took a poll right now, a lot of people on this call would be able to provide an example of a well-intended intervention or investment that you or your company has been part of with the goal of increasing the collection and recycling of plastics, or improving management of organic or food waste, or improving the livelihoods of waste workers. Unfortunately, a lot of these interventions, while well-intended, have taken a scattershot approach and take specific actions aimed at single points along a waste and recycling value chain that is, at the end of the day, inherently broken, meaning that a lot of those investments won't make sustainable impact going forward, and they often result in white elephants scattered across the waste management system. We at Delterra believe that the only way to have sustainable impact is to take a total systems view, to identify and address bottlenecks and challenges across the entire value chain, from waste generation through collection and sortation, aggregation and recycling, and processing at end markets. So that is the approach that we take to circular waste management, and I'm happy to talk about a couple of examples.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Actually, you talk about the size of the challenge, and it may seem a little bit scary to some of the members that are attending and that may hear these for the first time or don't know where to start. You talk about an inclusive and holistic approach, notably in the global south. Maybe why don't you tell us a little bit about what are the pieces of those approach? What are the type of actors you engage with? And maybe what are some of the concrete examples of how you take that engagement, leading it from pilots to actual impact at scale?
Happy to. So at Delterra, our systems-based approach works with stakeholders in municipal waste management and industry, and it aims to unlock innovative and scalable solutions that break the cycle of insufficient supply and weak demand for valuable materials. And we work on changing the behaviors and the economic drivers of post-consumer waste. So to break this cycle, Delterra works across two programmatic areas that can simply be mapped back to supply and demand. So our rethinking recycling programs work with communities, so households and businesses, and municipalities, so collectors and sorters, to develop self-sustaining recycling systems that maximize the quality and the quantity of the recyclable waste supply. While on the other side, our Reshaping Markets program works with industry to develop and deploy logistical, financial, technical, and digital innovations to ensure regional markets can reliably absorb high-quality recycled material at a viable price point. We firmly believe that systems that aren't connected will never work. And so a lot of our focus is really on building the bridge between supply and demand. Our work is focused predominantly in the global south, and we've been running programs in Indonesia and Argentina since the founding of the organization about 7 years ago, and we added on Brazil last year. Really importantly is that we wouldn't be able to do any of this work without the support of our strategic partners, including Mars and Amcor. These partnerships are critical for us to be able to develop and design and implement proof of concept projects in the markets that we work, invest in digital tools and infrastructure to monitor and evaluate the impact of our interventions, and really live a test, learn, and iterate approach. Ideally, the interventions that are funded by our strategic partners are then handed over to municipal governments or market forces to ensure the sustainability of those programs. And so we're really grateful to our partners who understand that working on systems change requires a long-term view and a long-term commitment, and that impact isn't always immediate. Next slide, please. So as mentioned on the previous slide, our Rethinking Recycling program works to empower cities and communities to build self-sustaining and inclusive recycling systems. We use a really structured and data-informed approach to design and implement interventions to improve waste management systems in the communities in which we work. We take a 4-step approach in all of the projects that we take on. This includes engagement and assessment. So with partners and cities and communities using our 6 dimensions of waste maturity framework, we do diagnosis and modeling of existing waste management systems to help identify the biggest bottlenecks and biggest opportunities for impact. We build interventions and build strategic roadmaps like behavior change campaigns, operations optimizations, investment strategies. And then we deliver and finance. We support cities to test and refine interventions, and then help put in place strategies to ensure sustainability in the long term. Next slide, please. So all of our programs, both across Rethinking Recycling and Reshaping Markets, are designed following sort of a think, do, scale model. Our path in Indonesia is that in 2019, we started working in Bali at the village level, where we launched a project to transform a single community waste management system. This phase of the project was really focused on generators of waste, mostly at the household level, and on increasing the collection and sortation of material, as the collection rates in Indonesia and Bali are extremely low. In 2021, we scaled that model to 40,000 people in 6 communities. And from 2024, we've been working to scale to 600,000 people in 60 plus communities across Bali. As at the organization, we really embrace a failing fast and learning mentality. We recognized about halfway through the second phase that the village level was not the appropriate unit of scale that would provide us the most impact. And so we shifted our approach to a more integrated Regency-wide system in partnership with an Indonesian government. So one case study from our work in Bali is about increasing organics diversion. But the broader story here is that this case also represents the culmination of years of work in Bali on institutionalizing the separation and formal collection of all waste streams at a household level. So this specific project, we worked to support an investment by JICA into an organics processing facility in a regency in Bali. JICA rightly understood that this project would not work if the material wasn't source separated and collected at the household level. So they brought Delterra in to help. In the Regency that JICA installed the facility, we educated over 4,000 families and businesses on source separation via in-person mass education events and using local partner organizations. We worked with JICA and the local government to improve operations and workforce management of the processing site, and we monitored the quality and quantity of the material, which dramatically improved through increased collection and source separation at the household level. To date, the sort of, I'll define it as short-term impact, is that we have processed and diverted from landfill, which is really important in Bali because the landfill is open and it's mismanaged. It's not a managed landfill. We've diverted 400 plus metric tons of organic waste, and at full capacity, which we're working on every day, the plant will be one of the biggest in Indonesia and be able to reduce about 13,000 tons of methane emissions on an annual basis. The real impact of this work is that the governor of Bali, in part because of this project and all of the work that Delterra has been doing over the past 6 years in Bali, has written a letter of commitment, which is the step before formal legislation, to mandate source separation of waste at home and mandate multi-stream collection of materials, including organic waste at the household level. So a proof of concept that was funded by a donor and implemented by a nonprofit has resulted in policy changes at the provincial level, making this initiative sustainable in the longer term. Our path in Argentina is very similar to that in Bali. In 2018, we started with a single pilot in a low-income barrio in Buenos Aires, with a goal of launching a recycling and waste management system in one neighborhood. I can report that that project is still going, supported by the local government and the community. We learned sort of through that process that the right unit of scale for our interventions in Argentina is actually at the municipal level. So in 2020, we started working with Oliveria, a municipality of about 120,000 people, to help transform their waste management system. And I'll talk about that case on the next slide. From 2023, we've been working on extending our programs into multiple municipalities across Argentina using the same approach. And we think that we're getting to about 20% of the Argentinian population through our scaling up of our Rethinking Recycling programs. So much like the Indonesian case study, this is a really great example of a proof of concept that was funded by a partner, which Delterra exited, and then the city of Olavarria is continuing to expand and run, including operating a new recycling facility. So we set out to prove that our model from the barrio works at a larger city of 120,000 people, and to increase recycling rates from less than 1% to at least 10% through putting in full waste segregation at the household level. So we worked alongside the Olavarria government and across the value chain to redesign city routes to be 3-stream curbside collection 3 times per week. We designed an organics collection and composting program for the city. We designed and made operational plans for a new recycling sorting plant. And we conducted behavior change at the household level to encourage source separation. And then also, really importantly, to provide confidence in households that their material was actually being collected and recycled. The outcome, again, short-term outcome, is that we have diverted 230 metric tons of waste from landfill, and we achieved up to 50% participation rates during implementation for recyclable separation and 30% participation rate during implementation for organics collection. The long-term impact of this work is, as I mentioned before, the city of Olavarria has taken over this project, and they now run it. They run a well-functioning waste management system. They still run 3-stream curbside collection 3 times a week. And for Delterra, there's really no better outcome. So again, a proof of concept funded by a partner was taken over by the city and is continuing today. So really quickly, because I know I only have a minute left. On the other side, Delterra works on the reshaping market side. We work with key actors across the materials value chain to strengthen markets and expand access to high quality, post-consumer, recycled and organic materials. So trying to keep valuable materials in the economy and out of the environment. These interventions are really focused on the value chain from the point of sortation through the end of productive use. And if you could go to the next slide, I'll give you an example. So our journey, our reshaping markets journey, is a little bit newer than our Rethinking Recycling one. In 2024, we launched a pilot in Argentina to try and enable the recycling of flexible, post-consumer flexible materials. So this case is a really great case study that even if you have fantastic separation and collection and sortation of materials, you still need a really robust end market for those materials and for that whole system to work. So the sort of impetus for this is that we observed in sorting facilities that cooperatives were throwing sorted film and flexibles directly into dumpsters and sending them directly to landfill because they simply didn't have anyone to sell the material to. And recyclers weren't purchasing this material because there was no market. So we identified 15 cooperatives to work with, and we introduced a short-term subsidy to incentivize them to separate out the materials. We trained 500 waste workers on identifying LDPE and on health and safety. And then we invested in sorting stations and tables so they had a dedicated space. At the same time, we worked with recyclers, a recycler, to install increased washing capacity and extrusion capacity. And then we worked with a partner to test the quality of the material that was coming out of that line. The project has now recycled 6,500 metric tons of LDPE that would have otherwise been sent directly to landfill. And while this is a success in terms of the amount of material that we've collected, as opposed to the previous 2 case studies, it isn't a long-term success. Yes, we've recycled 6,500 metric tons and eventually everything gets sold, but it's sold at fluctuating prices. It's often significantly discounted, and the prices are barely above production cost. So there are no long-term offtake agreements for these products, and the recycler doesn't want to continue to invest in this because they don't have confidence that the material will be off-taken. So this is a really great lesson learned for Delterra, and I think, again, highlights that if the supply and the demand aren't connected, the system won't work. So going forward, we're going to continue working on building long-term demand for the product, working with brands and converters, packaging producers to design and test innovative, sustainable financial mechanisms that can drive long-term demand for post-consumer, hard-to-recycle materials.
Thanks so much, Mike. And maybe we can come back to the discussion about the metrics and how we measure impact in a bit. I'd like to move on to Alison, because here among our audience, we have a big group of peers that either maybe at different moments in their journey reflecting about this topic. And Alison, you are Vice President of Packaging Sustainability at Mars, and you lead what you've called the cross-segment strategy, which I find very interesting, connecting the dots between sustainability, human rights, packaging, and waste. Where do I start? I think is a question that many of our members have done, or when I've got started but got stuck, where do I go? You've had some experience. What are some of the insights on how you built the business case at Mars and how you've gone or started to go through that path of that cross-segment strategy?
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria. If you could go to the next slide. First, thanks for inviting me on this call. And I also noticed some of my colleagues are on the call, so I can direct any of the more difficult questions towards them who are working with Delterra on the ground. So when we look at what is our strategy specifically for partnerships and what we call high leakage market, where there's lack of infrastructure and a potential for the waste to end up as leakage, unfortunately, we looked at the benefits across environmental, social, and business. So yeah, first of all, can the systems lead to reducing the amount of mismanaged waste and reduce potential leakage? Can we then, step one, moving it up the waste hierarchy, and we very much take a waste hierarchy framework. So step one, can we prevent it from leaking into nature? Then two, if we can get it into a managed system, can we then circularize that material? And we do want to increase the industry focus on flexibles, because we know that flexibles is what is often left either in landfills or unfortunately leaking into nature. So we do have a specific focus there. On the social side, we want to look at, how do we improve the livelihoods of waste pickers? We see these are some of the most impoverished people across all of our supply chains. They're working in abject conditions in many cases. So how do we include them in the waste systems and improve their livelihoods? And Mike talked about gender inequity within waste systems. So we do take that lens too. How do we look at it with a specific gender lens? What we found was, and Mike can speak to this even more, a lot of times the women, even in this informal sector, are doing the really, really difficult work. So how do we raise their livelihoods and raise their position in these systems? And then lastly, how do we train them to get more value from these materials? What are some basic things? Is it transportation? Is it training? Is it some basic equipment? Is it PPE? Like, what are the things that we can do to improve the efficiency so that they can get more value for the materials that they're collecting? And lastly, there's a business case for this, obviously. So we need the infrastructure to scale. You can design the best package in the world, but if infrastructure isn't there, the package could still, unfortunately, potentially leak into nature. Many of our peers and alongside Mars have recycled content goals. So we want to increase both the quantity and the quality. I think that those are both important. And Mike talked a little about different washing technologies that Delterra looked at, and that's essential, especially being a food contact business and having a food portfolio. We need to increase both the quantity and quality of recycled content, especially for the polyolefins portfolio, where the supply chain just isn't as robust as the recycled PET supply chain. And lastly, how do we collaborate across environmental and social? In a lot of our companies, we're very siloed. You have one team working on human rights, you have one team working on waste and packaging. How do we look across those to establish the right metrics and understand how we evaluate partners? As we're approaching this work, one of the reasons and one of the things we really liked about Delterra specifically and why we chose to work with them along with some other partners that we have is that they took a whole waste system approach. I know a lot of us, it's a plastics waste coalition of action, but you can't organize a system just to collect and manage plastic. You have to look at the whole waste management system. So I think that's really essential. And how do we include that? A lot of us are also in the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty. And again, while it's a plastics treaty, waste management has to be across all materials. So looking at programs that can take a holistic view of that total system was essential for us. And one of the reasons we gravitated towards Delterra. The other key part of this is working with governments. You have to have an inviting and enabling government environment, because if that's not there, these interventions are meant to be interventions, not ongoing programs. Mike talked a lot about how we were able to make these interventions and eventually the government took over. We were able to make the business case. We were able to show how this can work, train the informal sector. So having the right enabling environment with governments is essential. And as we go forward looking at different projects, that'll be an essential part and looking at where these interventions can have the biggest impact.
Alison, that's so great. And I think the key thing that you both, Mike and you, underline is how to have this inclusive and holistic approach to waste management. I really like that. All the scope of actors that are there to engage, but also how you put people at the center, because the waste pickers and the government policymakers are the pillar of these changes. But then while we're working on these changes, and the key question we always ask, how do we measure, how we track the impact we are creating so that we actually can see that change happening over time? What's your view, and how have you managed to measure some of that impact at Mars?
So if we go to the next slide, and I'll say these are just initial thoughts, right? I think in the waste space, and then even more so in the human rights space, there's not as clear metrics as SBTI, science-based targets, right, for greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of different factors that we have to include. So, these are some initial thoughts of how we can look at that. So how do we reduce leakage? How do we increase circularity? So we look at, what are the collection rates of materials? And then once it's collected, what's the efficiency of separation? And we do look at both the organic waste service and the recycling of flexible material, right? So how do we look at both of these streams? Again, given that we have a lot of food products, it's important to look at the total waste management systems. So that's more on the waste side. Then, we have it secondary here, but it's definitely not secondary in terms of the impact. Social inclusion, how do we look at the number of people improved? And then at some point, I think we'll evolve to how are their lives improved? How do we evolve that to better capture what that improvement looks like? Mike mentioned gender equality, so we want to ensure that we have that lens in this work. And then education. I think education is key, both waste worker education, consumer education, as well as government education, right? So I think these are some initial thoughts on KPIs to track. But again, as we get more into the work, as we learn more about what's really important, we expect to see these evolve. And I think this is where I welcome a lot of partnership with folks. There's, CGF, we've worked on the golden design rules in the past. How do we look at similar metrics that we could take across programs so that us and our peers are looking at similar metrics so that we can drive the right focus in our programs and in our partnerships?
Alison, that's a wonderful question, and one that is definitely being discussed at CGF as we drive more towards that inter-coalition collaboration to make sure that sustainability is seen as a whole, and that we are not competing between people and planet, because they both need to go in the same direction. And actually, can go back to you, Mike, give you a little bit more time to go into the numbers you were going to go, because they match perfectly with what Alison has just said in terms of the metrics. As to what is the type of impact you've measured through the program, some of the programs that you described earlier.
Yeah, definitely. If you could go. Perfect. Thank you. So I think very well aligned with what Alison presented. I think a couple of metrics of note that we are sort of especially proud of. The 850,000 people that we have reached by our behavior change program to date. This is through visits at the household level, mass media campaigns and via digital tools like our chatbots in both Indonesia and Argentina, all with the aim of educating people on the importance of source separation of waste at the household level. And then again, providing them confidence that their actions result in impact. And we've got a ton of anecdotal evidence from Bali and Argentina that if people are empowered at the household level, that then puts pressure on municipal governments to sort of enact multi-stream collection and curbside collection in the communities in which they work. And so we really think that it starts sort of from the individual and community level. Secondly, is the environmental impact that we've diverted 21,500 metric tons from waste from landfill and leakage into the environment through our programs to date. And this keeps really valuable materials in circulation and out of the environment. Again, we are a very materials agnostic organization. We work on the entire waste stream. We do a lot of plastics work because traditionally that's where a lot of the funding has been. We are increasingly doing organics work, which is extraordinarily difficult because if you don't think there's a lot of market demand for plastics, then you just need to look at organics and food loss and food waste to see where the difficulty really lies. So I think we're really proud of that metric, that it's not only plastics, but it's all materials. And then finally, and Allison hit on this as well, we have positively impacted the lives of over 1,100 waste workers, and more than 50% of those are women through our training programs. And then really importantly, I think, due to our work opening up new markets for materials that otherwise would have had no value to them. And Allison alluded to this as well. In my experience in East Africa, for sure, the male waste workers are really the ones who go after, and they have a right, quote unquote, right to go after more valuable material. So rigid plastics and PET are mostly collected by male waste workers in the informal sector, at least in East Africa. And females are left with sort of the harder to recycle films and flexibles that a lot of times have little to no value. And so I think working and continuing to work on opening up markets for hard to recycle materials and materials that currently have no value, one is good for environmental impact, and then two is really supporting female waste workers.
Yeah, and Mike, you don't mind me jumping in real quick, especially as we look at combining more with our human rights and people sections of our organizations. We see the same issue across multiple supply chains, right? We see this in our agricultural supply chains too, where women are doing the harder work and getting lower value for and getting less like compensation for the harder work that they're doing. So I think the more that we combine the different functions, we see that there's things that we can reapply and focus on across our programs. Because while we're focused on waste here, the problems and some of the systematic issues that we face are very similar.
Thank you, Allison. And hopefully as the problems are common, so can be the solution. So if we tackle that inequality somehow in these recycling supply chains, so can we in others. And we can start somewhere. I'm looking at the time, and I want to start to encourage people to start popping up questions in the Q&A feature, so we can ask those questions to our panelists. But while the audience warms up and feels like asking some questions, I have a few under my sleeve. Basically, we've talked about systemic change and like looking at this as a whole system of waste picking, but also recycling. What are some of those systemic barriers that have appeared? You've mentioned a few, but what are the biggest ones, and what are perhaps some of the opportunities to overcome those? What are some of the strategies that you found more effective that we could take on from today and apply so that we can face less barriers to overcome them easier wherever our audience is thinking of deploying this type of effort?
I think a couple of things that I think we've both talked about. So finding the right enabling environment is really key, because if you're facing either governments or systems that are not ready for this change, then you're going to face a lot of barriers there, right? And I do think trying to be holistic with what metrics you're looking at and what you focus on is important, because otherwise you can get too narrowly focused on just one piece of the problem and you're not solving for the whole system, which is necessary for work in the waste space.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think for me, it's a couple of things. One is lack of policy and financing, sort of getting at that enabling environment that Allison's talking about, right? I think it's hard, especially in the global South, where there are a number of potentially arguably more important issues to tackle, right? Education, healthcare, infrastructure, governance. It's really difficult for these governments to dedicate necessary resources to design and develop waste management systems, but they can definitely take the step of developing proactive policies. EPR is a really good example to help finance waste management. And I think secondly, what I talked about earlier is sort of the disconnect between supply and demand. You can have an incredibly well-designed and implemented collection and sortation system, right? Brazil comes to mind, where in larger cities, there is pretty extensive two-stream waste management collection covering a majority of the citizens, but you still have very low recycling rates as there isn't a lot of market demand for organics and films and flexibles. So I think it's really important to work on both at the same time. And I think only when you start to do that, you can sort of achieve real circularity for plastics and food waste.
Thank you both. And we actually have a question about EPR that you just mentioned. One of our audience participants is asking, what opportunities do you see about the regulations on EPR that are coming up in different parts of the world, and most recently in the US? What is the impact of those, and what can we do to make sure that impact is positive?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, and I should have mentioned this, one of the big things that we want these programs to prove is the ability to facilitate good EPR, right? This is almost a pre-EPR program. You're showing what good collection can do. You're showing what financing is necessary for the system. You're showing what materials can go through an effective EPR system. So in essence, you're helping prove out what good EPR could look like. And that reduces the risk of a badly designed EPR system. And so for us, this is also about risk management. We see a lot of bad EPR programs being proposed and some even unfortunately being legislated, right? There's good EPR, there's bad EPR, they're not created equal. So these programs are a really great opportunity for a relatively low amount and low investment to make an intervention and get a better system that works much better for you long term. Otherwise, you risk paying into an EPR system that doesn't work, and we would probably pay a lot more into those systems than we would for an intervention program that could demonstrate good EPR.
Yeah, you're talking like a bottom-up approach that would lead us to that most policy EPR change, but it requires in the Global South that specific approach that takes us step by step. And we have another question. What strategies are you thinking to deploy to create a stable demand pricing for recycled materials? Thoughts on decoupling from underlying index and not the same dependency on raw materials as virgin plastic? I think it's probably linked to a question about how do we create that economically viable model, and as you say, connecting demand and supply, how do we make that work?
I would say it's really difficult. I mean, first and foremost, I think it's really difficult. There are shocks throughout the entire system. Before joining Delterra, I worked for a large recycling company in East Africa, and we only collected HDPE and PP, and we didn't collect PET because there was no offtake market in Kenya that would purchase that material at a viable price, right? And so I think it's about creating potentially long-term offtake agreements, but creating confidence in the system that then runs down through recyclers and then through collection and sortation to increase the collection of those materials. We're also looking at sort of alternative offtake markets that are potentially not relegated or regulated. We are starting to dip our toe a little bit into the US and specifically in California and into the films and flexibles. I'm sure a lot of people on this call know that there is really progressive policy that is coming out that a lot of industry is really worried about, and it's looking at what are the alternative offtake markets that could absorb a lot of this. What is the technology required, and then what are some of the financial mechanisms we could put in place to help to facilitate the collection and the investment needed to produce high quality material that can then be reintegrated in its end use.
Yeah, and I think part of the answer for this question was actually the last question, right? Like well-designed EPR could look at incentivizing recycled content and offtake for recycled content. So as we get into eco-modulation, there's an opportunity there to incentivize, offtake of recycled content. I also do think that, participating in these programs gives you a seat at the table with the government so that you have more credibility when you're advocating for what good EPR looks like. So, so in case, and I see the participant list is from multiple functions throughout multiple companies. So I think that's really important to keep in mind as we're advocating in multiple countries. Programs like this help get you a seat at the table and a very credible seat at the table to work with governments as they're designing EPR programs, so that we can help with that eco-modulation for the second question.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely key. Getting a seat at the table is not always easy, but partnership and concrete action definitely is a way of positively constructing that way forward. One final question before we go to the closing remarks, because of course the webinar is hosted by CGF and we are here to create those opportunities for collaboration. In a few words, what do you think both would be the role of CGF in helping accelerate change in this space? What could we do as an organization that's hosting these 3 human rights, plastic waste, food waste coalition to facilitate this type of change, to move towards that systemic and holistic approach to the collection system change?
Yeah, I think both CGF and EMF, I know the previous webinar was on how CGF and EMF are working together, right? Helping us, again, just like we did with golden design rules, understand what are the right focus areas and metrics here, and then help, it's hard when multiple companies are doing multiple projects, and I know we all have different priorities. But the more that we can leverage our collective efforts, the stronger the programs will be. So can we pick a couple of markets together that we want to work collectively in a pre-competitive way to address, waste? I think if we have too many distributed efforts, then we don't get the scale that we're looking for. We don't get the proof points that we're looking for. So if there's a way to coordinate, again, between CGF and EMF together with our member groups to coordinate efforts in these countries so that we can focus on the impact that we can have and demonstrate the interventions work.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anything to add, Mike?
Ditto. Yeah, I mean, again, I think our strategic partnership cohort is a really good example of the power of multiple actors coming and enabling us at Delterra to design and implement proof of concepts that then have sustainable and viable impact going forward. So I would say come together more. If and when you do make investments, please don't make them on single interventions in specific points along the value chain. Think about the entire system and the ramifications of that investment on the entire system. Really try and drive sort of that linkage between supply and demand, because even if we're talking about plastic waste, if we don't have a really robust and sustainable and viable waste management system, you're never going to have a ton of impact on plastic solely. So I think just take that real systems level view and put your money into folks who have a lot of experience on the ground and local partnerships who are able to implement.
That's great. And I think the keyword of this webinar is definitely systemic approach. How do we connect the dots to address all the elements in the system? We've talked about the size of the challenge, the size in terms of plastic waste, the size in terms of the impact in people and on the planet. So 3 Ps. We also talk about partnerships, the key of enabling environments, and this is something we definitely have worked at the Human Rights Coalition as our key component to create that systemic change. We cannot do that alone with business. We need to bring along the communities that are all living the impacts, but can also be actors of change, and then the governments that can make this change sustainable over time, rather than just a punctual intervention that will last so long, but not be reliable over time. So we want to really that enabling environment that allows for change that is long lasting. And for that, we need consumers, we need waste pickers, and we need communities and governments to be involved. And as we close this webinar, I will ask my colleagues to launch a very quick survey, because we would want to know where you stand, what you learned through this session, if you're interested on us continuing this conversation and taking it somewhere in terms of action of what CGF can facilitate in trying to bring together those grids of reflections, trying to help those indicators evolve, but have also be able to leverage our collective effort, as Alison was rightly saying, so that we can focus on areas, we can identify what are the places where we can have more impactful action and actually turn that into concrete projects or concrete changes that we can start to do together. So please feel free to share your interest, to reach out to any of us, Delia, Lisa, and I, as well as Mike and Alison. We've had here really powerful examples of our communities, how companies and initiatives like Delterra can and have initiated change. And I think CGF should definitely be that safe space where we talk about the real challenges that we have, where we accept that this is not easy, but that we still want to keep this type of ambitions for our business, for our companies, and for our groups. And we work step by step towards facilitating that change at a larger scale. Thank you so much, Alison and Mike, for taking the time of sharing all this insightful experience that you've had on this topic. Thanks so much to Elisa and Delia, who have been working very hard to get this session together. And thanks to all of you for participating. We really hope to hear what you thought and hopefully continue the conversation after this, so that it can derive into some concrete action where we can leverage the power of the collective of CGF. Thanks so much and have a wonderful day.